There is a version of air combat that every pilot trains for and hopes never to face. It is not the clean geometry of a BVR engagement, two aircraft invisible to each other, the outcome determined by sensor advantage and the quality of the first lock. It is not the WVR merge, two professionals trading energy and angles in a contest where expertise and aircraft performance decide. It is something older and more chaotic, mass, more contacts than weapons, more identification requirements than decision time. A radar picture so cluttered that the problem is not how to engage, but what to engage, in what order, and whether the contact behind the one you are addressing is a threat or something else entirely. At 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, the radar picture over the Korean peninsula became that problem. The Korean demilitarized zone at 2:14 a.m. in winter is not a line. It is a 4-kilometer-wide strip of Earth running 250 kilometers from the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan, crossing mountain ranges and frozen river valleys. From 40,000 feet on a clear winter night, the DMZ is visible not by what it contains, but by what it separates. To the south, the lights of Seoul, the orange-white glow of 12 million people, 30 miles from one of the most heavily armed borders on Earth. To the north, structured darkness, the darkness of a country where electricity is allocated by priority. The E-2D Hawkeye working the Yellow Sea sector detected the first launches at 2:11 a.m. By 2:14 a.m., the launch count had reached 23 and was still climbing. The contacts were coming from 3 airfields in the vicinity of Suncheon, Hwangju, and Uiju, a geographic spread of 280 kilometers across North Korea's Western Air Defense Network. They were not climbing in formation. They were climbing individually at intervals of 12 to 40 seconds between launches, on headings that varied between 168 and 195 degrees. South, all of them south. Some climbing fast, some climbing at shallow angles. Some with afterburner signatures on the Hawkeye's infrared overlay, some without. At 2:15 a.m., the radar characterization of the contact types was in progress and producing a picture that the Hawkeye's tactical controller described in exactly 4 words before the launch count reached 30. Mixed. Types. All. Old. The electronic emission profiles across the 30 contacts were a catalog of hardware that the Korean People's Air Force had been operating for decades. MiG-29Bs radar signatures, MiG-23ML variable geometry radar returns, J7 copies of the MiG-21 with Chinese modifications, and among them, indistinguishable from their radar cross-section alone, a population of contacts that the emission profile matched to nothing in the KPAF's known combat aircraft inventory. The radar cross-sections of those uncharacterized contacts were small, smaller than a MiG-21, closer to the size of a large drone or a light propeller aircraft. The Hawkeye's controller knew the KPAF's An-2 Colt inventory, over 300 Soviet-era biplanes that North Korea maintained for special operations infiltration, flying at low altitude, wood and fabric construction producing minimal radar return, and An-2s mixed into a mass fighter launch. In the early morning darkness over mountainous terrain, on a night when the cloud deck over the northern valleys was solid at 8,000 feet, producing a radar environment where returns were intermittent below that altitude, and anything flying low enough could disappear into ground clutter entirely. The tactical controller had the launch count at 31 when the scramble order went out. 4 F-35B Lightning IIs from VMFA 121 embarked aboard USS America in the Yellow Sea, launched at 2:16 a.m. in a sequence separated by 35 seconds between aircraft. The F-35B's short takeoff capability meant no catapult. A rolling deck launch, throttle to maximum power, ski jump ramp at the bow, the aircraft climbing under its own thrust rather than the violence of a catapult launch. Less acceleration than a carrier launch. The same destination, the airspace to the north, at a bearing that was going to intersect a problem that no mission brief could fully prepare for. The flight lead had been awake for 6 hours on a watch cycle designed to maintain Alert 5 readiness at all hours. The scramble had come at 2:16 a.m. By 2:17 a.m. and 40 seconds, the aircraft was airborne, the ski jump ramp falling away below the canopy, the yellow sea beneath resolving from the abstract darkness of night vision into the gray-black of cold water at low altitude. The gear came up. The nose came up. The throttle advanced to military power, and the F-35B climbed through 2,000 feet on bearing 015.
The link 16 feed from the Hawkeye was already in the HMD. What it showed was unlike anything in the operational database.
34 contacts, now 36, spread between 4,000 and 28,000 feet. Speeds varying from 180 knots to 620 knots. Headings clustered in the southern arc, but not uniform, some direct south, some angled southeast, some on vectors that would take them over Seoul's outer suburbs, some that would pass east of the Han River, some that appeared to be orbiting, climbing in lazy circles that the Hawkeye's track algorithms were struggling to maintain continuously. The AN-2 contacts, the small, slow returns that were logging below 200 knots, were clustered below 3,000 feet and appearing intermittently as the radar picture flickered with the ground clutter of the Kaima Plateau's mountain ridges. 4 F-35Bs, 36 contacts and rising. The rules of engagement were printed on a card that every pilot in the flight had memorized, and the relevant line was unambiguous in its wording and impossible in its geometry. Visual identification. Required prior to ordnance employment against unconfirmed contacts. Visual identification. At night. Against contacts distributed across 60 miles of airspace between 200 feet and 28,000 feet. At closing rates that would put some of them at the DMZ boundary in under 4 minutes. The flight lead processed the tactical picture during the climb through 15,000 feet and arrived at a sequencing decision before reaching 20,000. The ROE visual ID requirement was not a bureaucratic obstacle. It was the recognition that this launch profile was unlike any documented KPAF offensive operation. Visual confirmation that these aircraft were armed and configured for offensive action, rather than a mass defection attempt, a training exercise, or a provocation without real intent, was the verification the geometry demanded before ordnance was employed. The 4 aircraft flight split into 2 aircraft sections. Lead and 2 took the western approach, bearing 015, targeting the higher altitude contacts that the Hawkeye's characterization had logged as probable MiG-29s, KPAF's most capable type, 12 in the inventory, the one that could pose the most immediate danger if armed and purposeful. 3 and 4 took bearing 025 toward the middle altitude cluster of MiG-21 and J-7 contacts that made up the bulk of the mass launch. At 2:21 a.m., the flight lead reached 32,000 feet and the first contact resolution on the APG-81. The radar picture at this altitude, looking north and down into the mixed layer below, was a controlled version of chaos. Solid tracks on the higher contacts, intermittent tracks on the low-level returns as the ground clutter and the Kaima mountain ridges periodically swallowed the radar energy. The highest contact in the picture, bearing 012 at 47 kilometers, 26,400 feet, speed 490 knots, a MiG-29 radar cross-section return, Topaz radar intermittently active in search mode. 2 radar emissions from that sector. A 2-ship, spread 8 kilometers apart, both climbing and accelerating. The flight lead turned to bearing 012 and pushed the throttle forward. The closure geometry would produce visual range in approximately 4 minutes at current speed differential. 4 minutes to get eyes on the MiG-29 flight and determine whether the aircraft were armed with live ordnance, configured for a strike profile, and inbound on a heading consistent with offensive action against southern targets. 4 minutes was the comfortable portion of the timeline. The contacts at 8,000 feet and below, currently 55 to 70 kilometers to the north, and closing at 280 to 340 knots, were a different calculation. Slower contacts, but contacts that would cross the DMZ line in 12 to 16 minutes and required their own identification sequence. Contacts that, if they were AN-2s carrying special operations troops and not armed aircraft, presented a completely different ROE situation than MiGs on a strike heading. The problem was that the radar could not tell the difference between an AN-2 full of troops and a MiG-21 flying slowly with its radar off in the ground clutter. Not at night, not at these ranges, not without a visual. At 2:23 a.m., the first human pulse. The flight lead closed to 18 kilometers on the lead MiG-29 and the HMD's DAS, Distributed Aperture System, 6 infrared cameras covering 360 degrees around the aircraft. Resolve the contact from a radar symbol into a shape. The shape at 18 kilometers on a clear winter night against a star-bright background at altitude was a silhouette. Swept wings, twin engine plumes, the distinctive shoulder-mounted engine nacelles of the MiG-29 family, recognizable from this range in the DAS imagery. Not a visual ID in the traditional sense, the pilot's own eyes could not resolve the aircraft at 18 kilometers without optical aid. But the DAS's infrared resolution at this range and geometry was sufficient for shape identification.
What the DAS could not tell the flight lead was whether the hardpoints under those wings were carrying live ordnance or empty pylons.
The closure continued. 14 kilometers, 11 kilometers. At 8 kilometers, the DAS imagery was resolving wing hardpoint geometry, the attachment points, the general shape of what was mounted versus unmounted. The lead MiG-29 was carrying something under its wings. The infrared signature of the pylons was consistent with loaded hardpoints. The thermal mass of a loaded weapon station is different from an empty pylon, and the DAS's FLIR channel was resolving that difference at this range.
The aircraft was armed.
At 2:24 a.m., bearing from the lead MiG-29 to Seoul's outer air defense boundary, 112 kilometers. At 490 knots in current heading, 13 minutes and 20 seconds. The MiG-29's radar, the Topaz N019, a 1980s generation pulse Doppler with a detection range against fighter-sized targets of approximately 70 kilometers, had been intermittently active throughout the approach. Not in targeting mode, in search mode. Either the KPAF pilot had not yet detected the F-35B at 8 kilometers, which was consistent with the APG-81 passive approach geometry and the F-35B's low radar cross-section, or the pilot knew the F-35B was there and was making a choice about whether to activate fire control radar. At 8 kilometers, the visual confirmation requirement had been met. Armed MiG-29, active radar, inbound heading, consistent with offensive action against Republic of Korea territory. The ROE condition was satisfied. The lead transmitted on the tactical discrete. 2. Lead. Contact 1 VID confirmed, armed, hostile profile. Fox 2, contact 1. Then, on guard. KPAF flight, you are being intercepted. Reverse heading immediately or you will be engaged.
No response on guard.
The AIM-9X left the rail at 7.8 kilometers. Seeker acquired in 0.9 seconds. The missile's infrared guidance locked to the MiG-29's engine plume. Cost, $400,000. The alternative, an armed MiG-29 on a strike heading to Seoul with 13 minutes of flight time remaining. The kinetic event occurred 4.1 seconds after release. The MiG-29's engine thermal signature on the DAS changed character. A kinetic event at the aircraft's rear fuselage. The airframe's aerodynamic coherence disrupted, the contact descending and decelerating in a manner that the flight data recorder would later characterize as consistent with catastrophic propulsion system failure. The pilot's ejection seat fired 2.8 seconds after the kinetic event. The parachute deployed. The pilot was descending toward North Korean territory 14 kilometers south of the departure airfield. The lead was already turning to the second MiG-29 in the element, the wingman, 8 kilometers to the east of the first contact's last position, now climbing and accelerating, the Topaz radar switching to fire control mode in the 4.1 seconds since the first engagement. The KPAF wingman had seen what happened and had made a decision, not to break and run, to fight. The Topaz fire control radar locked the F-35B at 6.8 kilometers. The R-60 infrared missile on the MiG-29's inboard pylon was uncaged. The seeker head was tracking. The KPAF pilot had the geometry for a short-range heat-seeking release, and he took it. The RWR screamed. Not the measured warble of a BVR radar lock, the full amplitude, close-range alarm of a WVR missile seeker actively tracking the aircraft from less than 7 kilometers. Fox 2. Defensive. The AN/ASQ-239 engaged automatically. IR countermeasures. The aircraft's defensive systems deploying flares in a pattern optimized for the R-60's seeker characteristics. The pilot was already maneuvering, not thinking about the maneuver but executing it, the body doing what 10,000 simulated repetitions had installed as conditioned response. A hard left bank, 7G, nose pulling down and left, placing the hot exhaust behind the aircraft's cold underside, breaking the aspect angle that the R-60's seeker was tracking. At 7G, the effective body weight was 560 kilograms. The G-suit compressed with maximum force against legs and abdomen. Vision narrowed. The AGSM, muscles clenched from chest to toes, sharp controlled breaths against resistance, was the only thing maintaining consciousness at the edge of the G envelope. The horizon in the HMD tilted 80 degrees as the aircraft rolled through the defensive break. The Korean peninsula visible through the left quarter of the canopy, as a patchwork of darkness and distant light, the mountain ridges below invisible in the pre-dawn shadow. The R-60 seeker lost the primary heat source and acquired a flare. The missile tracked the flare for 1.4 seconds before its seeker regained the discrimination algorithm and rejected the decoy. 1.4 seconds of seeker distraction. The maneuver had changed the geometry enough that when the R-60's seeker reacquired, the intercept solution was outside the missile's terminal maneuvering envelope. The R-60 passed 340 meters behind the F-35B's current position. 340 meters. The lead pulled out of the break at 22,000 feet, nose coming up. The MiG-29 now at 4.2 kilometers range, its Topaz radar still in fire control mode. The KPAF pilot pulling his own brake in an attempt to maintain the pursuit geometry. The WVR merge had happened in under 12 seconds. In those 12 seconds, the F-35B had gone from a controlled intercept geometry to a defensive situation and back to a neutral one. The MiG-29 pilot had executed correctly. He had not panicked after the first engagement. He had assessed the geometry. He had taken the Fox 2 available to him. The missile had missed by 340 meters. His next maneuver would determine whether he got another one. The answer was no. The F-35Bs HMDQ'd. AIM-9X had an off-bore sight capability that the R-60 did not. The AIM-9X seeker could lock a target 90 degrees off the aircraft's nose, using the helmet-mounted display to cue the seeker head before launch. The MiG-29 pilot, pulling his brake at 4.2 kilometers, was 55 degrees off the F-35B's nose, within the AIM-9X's high off-bore sight envelope, not within the R-60's. Fox 2. The second AIM-9X released at 2:25 a.m. in 14 seconds. Seeker acquired immediately. Kinetic event at 3.8 seconds. The second MiG-29 pilot ejected 1.9 seconds later. 2 ejections. 2 parachutes descending toward the mountains of North Hwanghae Province. 2 KPAF pilots who had made the decision to press the engagement and paid the geometry tax for that decision. The lead checked fuel, bingo, plus 18, and turned to the next priority sector. The tactical picture on the Link 16 had changed significantly in the 2 minutes since the WVR engagement. 2 was reporting. The middle-altitude MiG-29 and J7 formation had fragmented. 7 contacts were reversing course, climbing and turning north. 3 were maintaining southbound headings at diminishing confidence as the radar tracks became intermittent in the mountain terrain. The low-altitude contacts, the AN-2 population below 3,000 feet, had also fragmented. 6 contacts had reversed. 4 were maintaining southbound course at 180 to 220 knots, and 2 had descended below 1,500 feet into radar coverage gaps that the Hawkeye could not fully resolve. The 2 low-altitude contacts below 1,500 feet were the problem that the visual ID requirement made hardest to solve. At 1,500 feet over mountainous terrain in the pre-dawn darkness, 220 knots, crossing toward the DMZ, the radar picture said, possible, and 2. The possible in 2 might be carrying troops. It might be carrying ordnance. It might be a lost pilot in a different aircraft type who had descended below the cloud base looking for ground reference. At night, in terrain, at 220 knots, the visual identification geometry required closing to under 2 kilometers for the DAS to resolve payload configuration. At 2 kilometers from a low-altitude contact crossing terrain at 220 knots, the intercept geometry was demanding in a way that the BVR engagement had not been. 3 and 4 were already working the low-altitude problem. 3 had closed to 3 kilometers on the northernmost of the 2 remaining contacts, and the DAS was resolving the shape, biplane configuration, large fixed landing gear, fabric and metal construction. And 2. The payload geometry under the lower wing was unclear at 3 kilometers in the DAS thermal imagery. The AN-2's fuselage blocked the sensor line of sight to the cargo door. At 1.8 kilometers, the DAS resolved the configuration. No external stores, no visible weapons. Cargo door closed, no thermal signature consistent with recent opening. Troops inside possibly. Armed for offensive action, not confirmed. The ROE required confirmation, not assumption. 3 maintained visual track on the AN-2 and did not employ. At 2:29 a.m., the first AN-2 turned north. Not a commanded reversal. The aircraft had been continuing south for 11 minutes against a tactical picture that had turned from a mass launch into a disintegrating formation. Whatever the crew had been told before departure, what they were seeing on the navigation picture now was that they were alone, low, over mountainous terrain, in darkness, with no formation support and a tactical frequency that had gone largely silent. They turned north. The second AN-2 was 4's problem, 4 kilometers south of the first, 2,000 feet, 190 knots, crossing a river valley that ran north-south through the terrain. 4 closed to 1.9 kilometers, DAS thermal, lower fuselage resolved. External hardpoints. 2. Payload on hardpoints. Confirmed. Thermal signature consistent with loaded ordnance containers. And 2 configured for strike. Crossing the DMZ boundary in 40 seconds at current speed and heading. Lead 4. Contact is an AN-2. Visual confirmed. Armed. Crossing the line in 40. Request weapons free.
4 lead. ROE satisfied. Employ.
The KPAF-2 had been a weapons delivery platform in North Korea's Special Operations Doctrine since the 1980s. The scenario that doctrine described, low, slow, under radar, delivering payload against a rear area target in the chaos of a major offensive, was not an abstract capability. It was a real one. The aircraft crossing 4's sensor picture at 1,900 feet over a frozen Korean river valley was not a relic. It was a tool.
Fox 2.
The AIM-9X at 1.9 kilometers, seeker acquired in 0.3 seconds. Kinetic event at 1.8 seconds. The An-2's debris footprint dispersed across the snow-covered hillside on the North Korean side of the DMZ boundary, 800 meters short of the line. At 2:31 a.m., the Hawkeye controller's picture showed 29 of the original 38 launch contacts, now tracking north, northeast, or northwest, egressing, reversing, returning to their departure airfields or diverting to alternate fields across North Korea's western plateau. 4 contacts were not tracked. 2 MiG-29 pilots descending under parachute, 1 and 2 that had turned north before the DMZ, and 1 and 2 that had not made it to the line. 5 contacts remained intermittent in the mountain terrain, and the Hawkeye was working to reacquire. The flight lead transmitted. Sentry, Viper lead. Picture update. Mass launch fragmenting. 29 contacts egressing north. 2 contacts employed. 2 contacts reversed without engagement. Advised status of 5 intermittent tracks. Fuel state bingo plus 11. Available for tasking. Bingo plus 11. The engagement had consumed more fuel than the planning model predicted because the WVR defensive maneuvering had required sustained G and throttle that the fuel flow equations for a BVR intercept did not account for. Bingo plus 11 was workable. The 5 intermittent contacts in the mountain terrain needed resolution before the flight could RTB without a gap in the coverage. The flight's second friction event had occurred during the WVR engagement at 2:25 a.m. The DAS flagged a sensor degradation in the forward right quadrant camera, a partial obscuration from the thermal bloom of the first AIM-9X's motor plume, which had briefly saturated the adjacent camera's sensor for 3.2 seconds. The MiG-29 wingman had been in that quadrant during the window. The lead had been working from a partially degraded situational awareness picture for 3.2 of the most critical seconds in the engagement. The post-flight DAS diagnostic would show the saturation event. The debrief would discuss whether a more sophisticated adversary might have exploited that window. In this case, the KPAF wingman had not known about it. The 5 intermittent contacts resolved over the following 11 minutes. 3 were MiG-21s that had descended below 8,000 feet and were tracking north at low altitude through valley terrain, a tactic suggesting at least some KPAF crews had briefed low-altitude egress routes, which meant the launch had not been entirely unplanned. 1 was an An-2 orbiting at 1,200 feet, apparently unable to navigate in the darkness at low altitude. It reversed north when 2 closed to 5 kilometers. 1 contact disappeared entirely and was not reacquired. The DMZ boundary, at 2:42 a.m. when the final flight landed back aboard USS America, was where it had been at 2 a.m. The lights of Seoul to the south were unchanged. The darkness to the north was unchanged. The mountain ridges that separated them were unchanged. 34 of 38 contacts had reversed or been accounted for. 2 had been removed from the picture before reaching the line. The line had not been crossed by any armed contact. The debrief was 40 minutes long, followed by a 4-hour intelligence processing session. The mass launch had not been preceded by any preparatory signatures that KPAF offensive doctrine called for in a genuine first strike. No artillery preparation, no unusual ground force movement, no communications traffic suggesting a coordinated combined arms operation. Working assessment, a provocation or test. Whether the specific objective was testing response times, ROE thresholds, or saturation capacity would require additional collection to confirm. That collection was already in progress. The launch had been an intelligence event. 38 KPAF aircraft aloft simultaneously, radar emissions, navigation patterns, communication behaviors, and individual performance characteristics recorded across 4 sensors for 26 minutes. The KPAF and 2-strike configuration was confirmed in an operational context for the first time. The MiG-29 crew's willingness to press a WVR engagement after the first loss was noted and would update the threat assessment for that type. 38 contacts. 4 F-35Bs. 28,000 feet maximum engagement altitude. 1,900 feet minimum. 26 minutes from first launch to DMZ boundary clear. Airspace yielded 0. Contacts reversed before the line 34. Contacts removed from the picture 2 armed aircraft and 1 armed and 2. ROE compliance confirmed on every employment. Message delivered to whoever had issued the launch order in Pyongyang. The saturation model did not work. The line did not move. The response was faster than the model assumed and more precise than the mass launch geometry could defeat. At 3:10 a.m., the Yellow Sea below USS America was calm and dark. The flight deck was lit in the red and white of night operations, the aircraft being chalked and chained by deck crews in cold weather gear, the exhaust from the STOVL engines fading in the winter air. To the north, 110 miles of sea and then the Korean peninsula, and somewhere on the other side of its mountains, a radar picture that showed 34 aircraft returning to their airfields and a flight frequency that had gone silent. Whatever the launch order had been meant to test, the answer was now in a data recorder on a flight deck in the Yellow Sea. The answer was not the one the launch order had been hoping for.